When I got that in my hands, I was shaking because I thought this is so priceless.
He got shrapnel in his shoulders, shrapnel in his leg.
One farmer said he would prefer to spend 10 years at the Western Front than 1 year in the Mallee.
There's not much to see in Annuello. A fire station, a community hall now barely used, and like every town in the wheat belt, a grain silo. Annuello is a ghost town. The last resident departed 50 years ago. But fond memories live on.
Beavis's old blacksmith shop was back up there.
Yeah, where the shed was.
94-year-old Jim Taggart and Terry Murphy, 86, spent their young days here.
This is where Gallagher's store, post office and the bank at the front was here.
In their mind's eye, it's still vivid. Only a handful of people remember the town firsthand. But later this year, this long-gone hamlet will host a reunion of past residents and their descendants.
Got everything organised, Greg?
The impetus came from local farmers, Greg Plant and Andrew Zanko. Part of the inspiration came from this wonderful photo album, found in an op shop in Melbourne. It once belonged to a former settler.
This is his records of his travels right up from Wood End to Annuello, and he's got a history of his photographs in here. That one here might take...
We just thought, well, there's probably so much information or photos out there that we were going to lose if we don't do something, and that's probably the main aim.
Annuello sprang up in 1919, part of a soldier-settler scheme dubbed the New Mallee. One of the many ex-servicemen who took up the offer of land was Arthur Drinkwater.
The Minister of Agriculture told his father, look, young Arthur better get up to Annuello where they're opening up new ground and he'll make an absolute fortune within 5 years. And little did they know what was around the corner.
This was the scene that confronted those early Mallee settlers, and this was the land that would supposedly make them prosperous farmers. These are Mallee trees, one of the most resilient and hardy of all eucalypt species, and they grew so thickly that when Arthur Drinkwater arrived here to take up his allotted land, it took him 3 days of bashing through the scrub before he could even locate the survey pegs.
Just imagine walking around in scrub, you know, like I get out in the scrub now and I think, now where's the sun, you know, trying to get my directions. You can only imagine what it would have been like.
As far as you could see, it was just Mallee scrub. And from day one, they had to start clearing it.
Clearing it firstly meant trying to flatten it with what was called a Mallee roller, made from a large log or an old steam boiler and pulled by a horse team.
The ground had to be rolled, it had to be heaped up, it had to be burned, and then they'd try and grow a crop, and of course the shoots of the Mallee roots kept coming through.
A lot of the scrub didn't run a burn and they'd have to individually burn the trees, and then what didn't burn they'd pick by hand into heaps. So it must have been fairly daunting to go to work every day and see the same old thing.
It was relentless work, but often it took years to fully clear the land.
And they didn't have the equipment that even when I went up there in 53 to do it, most of it was done by hand, just chopping it down.
Arthur Drinkwater also managed to photograph and document his titanic struggles.
When I got that in my hands, I was shaking because I thought this is so priceless. Handwritten note of Arthur Drinkwater of his early days at Annuello.
At one stage, his diet was so poor, he suffered with scurvy and sandy blight, a severe eye disease inflamed by heat and dust. Arthur's son, George Drinkwater, now 86, heard many of the stories, such as the lack of water. The settlers were promised a pipeline, but it took years to build, so the newcomers carted water from a dam, also used by the wildlife.
He had to cart a furphy load of water twice a week for 5 miles. He would start off, depending on when he ran out of water, but even if it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, He'd start off to get the water. He'd get his water and he'd get back at 2 o'clock in the morning. And that went on for 5 years.
For 6 years, Arthur lived in a tent until, in 1925, he brought his new bride home to a modest house. Others built humpies from hessian bags and scraps of corrugated iron.
One farmer said he would prefer to spend 10 years at the Western Front than 1 year in the Mallee. So when you think about the conditions that they faced and lived in on the Western Front, it hits home of how tough it was.
It must have been so hard for the women folk to have very little water and not very good quality water, and we had to try and bath their children and everyone, and I guess it didn't happen very often.
Older residents recall the periodic intense dust storms.
And they had terrible dust storms. And I can remember my mother-in-law saying, you know, on one Christmas Day, they had all this food laid out, and then a dust storm came and they had to cover everything. So they were eating not only whatever nice things they prepared, but dust as well.
The land didn't come free. Soldier settlers had to repay government loans. It often took 4 or 5 years to make the land arable, so any returns from a grain crop went into repayments. It reduced most settlers to a subsistence lifestyle.
There was a family out to the east of Annuello and they were living on nothing but boiled wheat. Now that wouldn't have been uncommon.
These ex-servicemen had survived the horrors of war, only to confront more hardships here. Arthur Drinkwater had cheated death in the trenches of the Western Front, in one instance taking shelter in a shell hole with 4 others during an intense artillery barrage.
He had that feeling, he said, "There's no good here." So he dived out, zigzagged along the trenches, and was just on the edge of the explosion that blew those poor devils to pieces. Looked up in the air, he said there was boots and arms and God knows flying everywhere. He got pretty severely injured himself. He got shrapnel in his shoulders, shrapnel in his leg.
So after recuperating, he became a pilot in the Royal Flying Corps. Flying primitive, flimsy planes, he became a distinguished air ace on the Western Front.
Official war record says 9 planes down. I have read certain articles which says he had 13 planes down.
But again, death was all around him.
He was the only one alive out of 86 personnel in 6 months.
Greg Plant's grandfather, Sidney Plant, was an army padre and a soldier settler.
But I don't think he had any great farming knowledge like many soldier settlers, and that was probably part of the problem, that they weren't farmers, but they had to do something with them after they were back from the war.
For most, this was a battle they could never win. Almost without exception, these settler blocks were unviable, too small and too dry.
And horror for so many of them who had never really farmed before.
They were really up against it right from the start. They really had no chance at all.
The 1920s brought drought years and few big harvests. Then prices crashed disastrously and the Great Depression took hold. For many, it was the final straw.
You can understand why many people just walked away.
The town's population, almost 400 in the early 1930s, quickly dwindled. Farm blocks were abandoned, families moved away. Terry Murphy's father ran the Annuello butcher shop, but for many, meat was unaffordable.
Mum had a cafe and mixed business, growing groceries and that sort of stuff. Until 39, when all the farmers started moving off the land and so forth.
Barney Gallagher and his wife Lou ran the store and post office, and their boundless generosity saved many families from starvation.
My father always admired the character of the Gallaghers, who knew they weren't going to get paid, but they still supplied food to you know, the early pioneers.
They would see him and say, "We're going on the train tomorrow, Barney, and we need some money to get a ticket." So he would give them the money for a ticket.
Despite the adversity, there was intense community pride in what they were achieving and what they had done during the war. In 1934, a group of 6 Annuello soldier settlers rode their horses to Melbourne to the opening of the Shrine of Remembrance.
It was obviously a lot of mateship and obviously something they felt very strongly about. It's a long way to ride a horse.
The journey, led by Barney Gallagher, was almost 500 kilometres and took 5 days.
Barney led the convoy of horses, and he led a riderless horse called Bonnie, which had a wreath around Bonnie's neck, which was made by Mrs. Hitchcock, Barney's mother-in-law.
And it was made out of mallee leaves and mallee nuts. She was very artistic, and it was obviously very beautiful.
Back at Annuello, the decline continued. In 1946, the school with just 5 pupils was closed.
It wasn't really until the 50s that the Mallee really started to prosper, when they started to think that they were probably getting somewhere.
Greg Plant's family is one of the few remaining original settler families. Many of the old settler blocks make up its grain-growing enterprise. These farming pioneers would no doubt gaze in wonder at the sheer size and capability of modern agriculture.
We owe so much for our forebears that somehow managed to stay here, because without their efforts we wouldn't be here.
In 1976, the Annuello store was the last business to close.
That was the last one to finish up. Actually, a windstorm had blown the front veranda off it before it did close.
A century since Annuello began, and half a century since its demise. In August, the handful of former residents still living, and the many descendants will meet here to celebrate this mere dot on the map. Among them, Leonie Gallagher and her family.
It was really tough. Even when I arrived up there, it was still tough, but not as tough as they had it in those early days.
Annuello may be a ghost town, but its ghosts are not yet silent.
But it is incredible to see the history that we have been able to find.
It'd just be nice for it just to live on just a little bit longer, just so that when people drive through Annuello, some of them may think, well, it's not just a wasteland that's got absolutely nothing there now, to remind of that fabulous history of Annuello.